Bonjour! Good evening. Minogijigat. Welcome to the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we acknowledge any previous or present-day Aboriginal people who come to reside on this territory, namely the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wyandot, and the mighty Métis Nation. So when we look at that, to welcome you here, a lot of you aren't from Canada. Could I have a show of hands? How many are not Canadians here? Ooh, wow. So, so you're moving into a whole new realm of environmental outlooks from the Aboriginal people here in Canada. We have a commitment. We have a sacred trust to keep this lands in good stead for the future generations. And we're finding more and more that the governments are finding that Aboriginal people have an ingrained identity with everything that's around them, and the environmental things that we do are amazing. Where they thought a lake was going to be completely depleted of all the fish because they commercial fished it, they had the federal government purchase the licenses from the non-native, and within a span of 20 to 30 years, they had that lake producing fish so that it was a commercial viability. So by utilizing the teachings that we had from the past. So in saying that, I fed your minds a little bit, and I hope to, when I get out of here, I can go get something to eat so I can feed my body. And but right now I'm going to help you to feed your spirit. And this song is, we call it the prophecy song because it tells of a time when the Aboriginal people will be opening the door of understanding to the rest of the world so that they can see how to look after our Mother the Earth. Jibwani banda abindagego anakwagingaba abindagego anakwagingaba Jibwani banda from Majanda. Let's go over there. Jibwani Banda. Before we go to sleep and forget. Abindagego Anakwagingloba. For the fire of learning and knowledge has been lit, and the doorway is open. Abindagego Anakwagingloba. The doorway to understanding. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, and that was a wonderful way to start out. I'd like to also start my remarks by acknowledging that this land on which we are gathered for thousands of years has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Thank you. And welcome to the North America Congress for Conservation Biology. We will be talking today about conservation science, policy and practice, connecting the urban to the wild. But I want to recognize that that beautiful song that we heard is a wonderful way to think about what we're doing in this particular Congress and opening those gates to learning and understanding. And I hope we can all open those gates within our own hearts, minds, and souls to that sort of understanding that we're hoping for. I would like to remind everyone in this process that you all have agreed to abide by the code of conduct. And I say that not as a punitive thing, but as a way to make everyone feel as welcome as they possibly can. And I take that very seriously. So if you have any questions or concerns about inclusivity or any issues that arise, I ask you very sincerely from the bottom of my heart to please find me and contact me. The information for if there are any conflicts that arise are on the back of your badges. So if there are any conflicts where you feel like there's been any violations of that code of conduct or any discriminatory behavior, we take that very seriously, and we'd like to hear from you. And I personally would like to hear from you. So please speak to me, or if you have any constructive suggestions, not an issue, please come speak to me as well. So I'd like to also start by inviting our board members to stand up. So the North America section board members, please stand up. I am the president, Dr. Jessa Madosky. Carlos Carroll, which many of you probably know, is the past president. Karen Root is our president-elect. And we also have many other leaders. A couple people I want to point out. Gerald is also involved. Gerald is right back there. Gerald is also involved with the equity, inclusion, and diversity aspect of it. So I know he's excited to get started on that and would welcome conversations. And Sergio is our past equity, inclusion, and diversity officer, and I'm sure is also eager to have all sorts of conversations. But I'd also like to recognize Sarah Klain from Oregon State, who's our student representative, Brett Hartle, who is our Vice President for Policy and Programs, Steve Trombilak, who's our Vice President for Education and Chapters, Rebecca McCaffrey, who is our Chapters representative, and Kristen Cardin, who's one of our members at large, and Aaron Jacob, who's one of our members at large. And, of course, our wonderful staff member, who I'm going to make stand up, Jamie Hogberg. And I will say this, all the things that went right about the Congress are because of Jamie's hard work and the hard work of our local organizing committee, and everything that goes wrong is my fault. So address complaints to me, and I apologize in advance. So, next, we'd like to say our welcome from Marie-Josée, who's going to come up and speak to us a little bit more. But thank you all for being here, and I hope to have conversations with all of you throughout the course of this Congress, and I encourage you to approach this Congress with an open mind and a willingness to hear other points of view, and in fact, to seek out other points of view that might be different from your own and learn from them, as well as sharing your own information. Thank you for being here.
So I would like to welcome you on the behalf of the local host. There's 3 groups that made this possible. So first of all, of course, there's the Society for Conservation, the Toronto chapter. And I would like to analyze, a meeting cannot occur without people and organizations. So the people that were behind the possibility to have this meeting in Toronto is Christopher Blackford in the back. He worked in collaboration with Amanda Zurek. I cannot pronounce her name. She's just my former PhD student. And Jen Shiver, that were the engine to propose the occurrence of this meeting here in Toronto. So we are very thankful to all their effort and the energy they put into this. Then there's the University of Toronto. There is the university as large is really happy to promote the teaching and the research and conservation, and they were very happy to be co-hosts of this event. And then there's the Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and then in the person of Justina Ray, and I will try to say her name, Cheryl Chikiewicz. I just say it very quietly. I don't know how to. She's just there. So basically, those people were key to have this local organization. And of course, we were always in contact with the co-chair of this event, Jamie Huckberg. She was the most pleasant, efficient person to work with. And I'm very privileged to have her as co-chair. Then, of course, the meeting needs some funds, so we need to acknowledge, thank you, our sponsors and the people that were able to get such money. So there was Carlos Carroll, Nick Mandrak, and myself. We were lucky to convince people to give us money for this meeting. So we had people that were give us a lot of money. And some that give a lot of their time. And so we had Doris Duck Charitable Foundation, the Wilberforce Foundation, U of T, University of Toronto, sorry, Conservation Science Partner, Metcalfe Foundation, Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada, Credit Valley Conservation, Center for Biological Diversity, Fishery and Ocean Canada, DFO for local people, and Park Canada. Then there was a series of the groups that gave us in-kind help, and we acknowledged them in the programs. And there was other people to be thanked, but I think it's not my role. I will pass that to the most wonderful co-chair that one can dream of, Jamie Huckberg, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here. We've been working on this for 2 years, and it's really amazing that it's now actually here. I do want to just start out by thanking Marie-Josée. It's equally been really incredible to work with you, and I'm so happy to have had the opportunity. So I do want to run through just a few more really important thank yous before we get started. So this slide has a lot of text on it. There is a pretty large contingency of volunteers that made this happen. If there's anybody in the room who is on the organizing committee for this conference, I'd really love if you would stand up. And I'd love to give you a round of applause. Thank you all. In particular, I do want to just call out a handful of individuals that are hard at work. Not all of them are in this room because they're running registration, one including Chris Blackford that Mauritius already mentioned, Chris Edge, Salita Guy, Lauren Jonitis, Amy Huntington, Miranda Baksh, Juan Vargas Soto. Thank you all so much. I'd also like to thank Brooke Alexander, who's done all of the design for the conference, as well as Carol McNeil, who you will all hopefully get the chance to meet. She's out at registration as well. She's an incredible conference planner and really integral to making this happen. So thank you all. Some additional thank yous. There are so many people that have had a hand in making this possible. So I would like people in the following categories to please stand. If you're an abstract reviewer for the conference, please stand up. If you're a student presentation award judge, please stand. Everybody at once. A moderator for contributed or speed sessions. And any volunteer at any time that's going to take a shift. So there's a lot of you, and thank you. So I'd like to just throw in a few important reminders throughout the week. There's so much going on, there's so many events, and we really hope you're able to make the most of all of it and come to everything that you can. Just a reminder, on Tuesday, we'll have our SCBNA members meeting in this room. If you're a member, and if you're not, please join us. We'd love to convince you to be one. We will talk a little bit about the society, gain some feedback from you as we move forward. We'll also have our award ceremony and an opportunity to get some prizes for bingo. So if you haven't already picked up a little bingo card, this is really designed to be interactive, fun, to get you all to engage a little bit more and network. So we'd love for you to participate. A couple other things. So on that note of interactivity, please do attend an interactive session if you have a chance. This is new this year. We really want to promote a lot of different platforms and how we can do conservation science and collaborate with each other. So we'd love for you to join us for those sessions. And an additional opportunity that we just launched in this past week is honoring requests and offers for presentations to be filmed. So some of you may have seen this on Twitter. We're really hoping to pull this off, but it's a totally volunteer effort. So if you are willing to film any of these sessions, please come to registration, follow Twitter, get instructions. It should be really easy, but we'd really love to make the conference as accessible as possible. More than anything, have fun. I hope you have a really great week. Come see us if you need anything. Thank you.
Well, Jamie, here it is. I'm Nancy Barron. I'm with Compass. This is our third NACCB, and we're thrilled to be here. And I'm especially thrilled because as a Canadian, I started my career as a national park biologist in Banff. The topics that we're going to be exploring here today are near and dear to my heart, and there are so many old friends, but I'm equally excited about the new friends we're all going to make, and that's a big part of what we do here. As we're here at NACCB, we being Compass, to help catalyze new conversations, hopefully amongst yourselves, but also by bringing in an amazing group of journalists. So they too can learn about your discoveries in the field, the insights into nature that you're going to be sharing with each other, and then hopefully spread the word to audiences beyond these walls. Today's opening plenary will take place in 3 parts. First, we'll set the stage with short talks from 3 accomplished conservation experts, Larry McDermott, Justina Ray, and Faisal Mullah. Then we'll introduce 2 distinguished journalists to launch us into a lively conversation, thinking about the road ahead, new thinking and opportunities for conservation. Where can we go from here? Finally, as a bridge into the opening reception, we'll do rapid-fire self-intros of the journalists so you can put a face to their name and start conversations that we hope will continue during the next 4 days. Now, I know this model works because I spent the morning reading some of the coverage from the last NACCB, and you'll be hearing from Kendra Pierre-Louise later, who is one of our journalists who is now at the New York Times. 2 years ago, she was a journalist fellow, and she's written some amazing stories, one about bats and green rooftops in New York City, and another one about why bears aren't hibernating anymore in Nevada. So the stories don't come out right away, but they're like seeds being sown, and it's really about long-term relationships and making those new connections here. The theme of this conference and this plenary, connecting the urban to the wild, is beautifully represented by this. North America's vast geography illustrates the tremendous gradient in the human footprint, from some of the most densely populated urban landscapes in the world to largely intact roadless areas in the north. Looking at this image from space and at night helps us see the urban and the wild with fresh eyes. No political boundaries are evident, yet surrounding us all are the shifting laws of the land and the many dimensions that determine what is happening, not only for ourselves, but also to natural environments and animals trying to carry on with us or despite us. Canada still has wild areas. I know you're all looking at these places and thinking of places you love and you know. These beautiful dark places offer hope, but hope with its sleeves rolled up. It's going to take much work by all of us to help sustain what is left in both the urban and the wild. Conservation is why we are all here, of course, and this gathering provides an opportunity to celebrate conservation achievements and examples of innovation against a socio-political backdrop that presents both threats and opportunities. Few places are out of reach of the escalating threats of climate change and human alteration of natural habitats. But Canada also offers a conservation opportunity with the chance to act before it's too late. The Canadian government's recent decision to allocate $1.3 billion to the protection and stewardship of ecosystems and wildlife over the next 5 years is an uplifting opportunity. Conservationists have described these investments as historic. They are. They'll help Canada meet international targets for establishing protected areas. But just as significant is the federal government's recognition of Indigenous-led conservation in Canada, including tribal parks and Indigenous Guardians programs tasked with the day-to-day stewardship of lands, waters, and wildlife according to traditional laws and values. In the words of a recent groundbreaking report by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, in Indigenous worldviews, conservation is achieved when the relationships and uses that have conserved the lands and waters for thousands of years remain intact or are re-established. There's no better example of this potential than in Canada today. To set the tone for our opening discussions, we have three deeply thoughtful speakers who can help us connect the history of this land with contemporary conservation practices and issues. We'll begin with Larry McDermott to provide us with an enduring Indigenous and historical context. Larry McDermott is a world-respected environmental trailblazer. He is a member of Shabbat Abadjawan First Nation and Executive Director of Plenty Canada, an organization dedicated to environmental protection and healthy communities. He is Indigenous co-chair of the we did a last-minute edit here, of the Canadian Commission of Man and the Biosphere, and a member of the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity. His philosophy is based on the need to respect both Indigenous knowledge and Western science equally, taking responsibility for living within nature's means, and in his words, this means everybody needs to work together. Larry will provide some historical context for partnerships between Indigenous people and Western science and culture from the past to the present, and share what he thinks are both our rights and responsibilities that will lead to more effective connecting of the urban to the wild. Welcome, Larry.
Kwekwe, Uamsi Indigenous Cause, Makwan Nodam, Chimigwich, Mashomas. Thank you, Elder, for the opening and for welcoming us to your territory. And I want to thank your ancestors, your nation, for caring for the land, because of your commitment, we're able to share in the bounty and the incredible renewal of life that comes from that relationship. I'm going to talk briefly, as Nancy has introduced, what I would say are the opportunities to learn from the past, to guide us in the future. This ribbon shirt that I'm wearing, I haven't worn since March 27th. And on March 27th, Pathways 1 came to a point where a couple of reports, these, Nancy already mentioned the Indigenous Circle of Experts, We Rise Together, and there was also the National Advisory Panel, Canada's Conservation Vision. Interestingly, both recognize the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science, working for the cause of the continuation of life, to deal with some of the most pressing problems, habitat destruction, the loss of biodiversity, and climate change. And some of what this process did, I mentioned that I was wearing this ribbon shirt, and that's because we were guided by Elder Dr. Reg Croshoe, a Blackfoot elder from Alberta, who established a co-governance model. And this co-governance model, Reg would agree, took a look at how we came together as European and Indigenous peoples, in particular in that period of time in which the Proclamation of 1763 was issued, and the subsequent Treaty of Niagara. What is notable about that is the fact that Indigenous peoples came from great distances in most cases. Some of those people took 3 months just to arrive at Niagara for treaty discussions. What was first and foremost on many of those Indigenous representatives, and there were plus or minus 2,500 of them, was the rapidity in which trees were being cut, fish were being harvested, and a concern that we weren't living in accordance with natural law. By those teachings that Indigenous peoples were governed by, the ability to listen to the voices of all of creation, the voices of the land and the voices of the water. So in those treaty negotiations, the Crown, led by Sir William Johnson, knew Indigenous language. They knew how to produce wampum. They knew Indigenous protocols, and so meetings were often open in a similar way to the way that we opened today. And the Pathways One process borrowed from that experience. But let me talk a few minutes about a few important events that laid the groundwork. So that nation building, and we hear of the nation-to-nation relationship, and that was the understanding, certainly from an Indigenous perspective, that was occurring in 1764. It laid the groundwork for our relationships. I would argue both sides of the border. And then in 1815, at the end of the War of 1812, and after the Treaty of Ghent, along with Article 9 that reaffirmed that relationship, reaffirmed the rights that had been affirmed in 1764. This is a replica of a wampum belt that was created in 1815. And again, it was a reaffirmation. I refer to this as the Pledge of the Crown Belt. And there were teachings, and there are different perspectives about the teachings, laws, and of course they came from a number of nations. But Dr. Reg Crochue then referred to the grandmother-grandfather teachings. Some see them in different ways. But the first one is love, represented by, in my language, Migizi, or the eagle. And when this belt was issued, William Klaus said, it will be our love and affection that gets us through challenging times. And so one interpretation is that the wavering parallel lines are our relationship, and that relationship will be challenged, and most certainly it has. And there are many events, but in 10 minutes, I don't have time to cover them all. But we all know there was a period of time in which the world, together, globally, we had an awakening. One could say, well, one could pick any date, but I'm going to pick the 70s and the 80s. I'm thinking of Gro Brundtland and her report. Leading up to the Earth Summit in 1992, which I had the honor and privilege of attending as part of the Indigenous delegation from Canada. And it was recognized at that time that we needed to bring our global strengths, which meant that not only was Western science an important tool, so was the wisdom and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples around the world. This was again recognized in 2010 at the Nagoya Convention of Parties. I was there for that as well. And so the Aichi targets, and probably everybody here knows that, were established. That included 11. the expansion of parkland, and hence this process in which ICE and NAP came together to follow through on Canada's treaty commitment under the Conventions on Biological Diversity and Climate Change. But again, another of those important Aichi targets was Target 18, the recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems and the full inclusion in a respectful way of those systems in dealing with the challenges identified in the convention, actually conventions. And so the Pathways 1 process, led by Dr. Croshu, an individual who worked as a young man, worked with elders in the late 70s and early 80s on the constitutional process, and those elders determined that it was time to refer to our cross-cultural literacy, the kind of literacy that we had in 1764. So they brought out the pipes, they brought out the wampum, and they brought out the ceremonies, and they influenced the Canadian Constitution such that articles like Section 35 exist. But that knowledge, as I've already mentioned, is a critical element. That knowledge of how to work together, that knowledge of respectful engagement, that cross-cultural skill. Elder Albert Marshall from Eskersoni refers to it as two-eyed seeing, that by only looking either from an Indigenous perspective or a Western science perspective, we see one thing, but when we bring them together, our view, our solutions, our respect for our first responsibility, which is to care for the land, is that much stronger. And so it was an honor and privilege in tabling these reports with copyright. It was Dr. Reg Croshu's idea that we videoed oral summary. We had a drum, and we sang our sacred songs, and we had a pipe ceremony. And certain portions of that were videotaped, and the equivalent of copyright for the video was a QR code. And what Dr. Croshu was saying is that video has become one of the modern means of passing on oral Indigenous knowledge systems. So that was done. And so that has launched a process and has launched recommendations. And it was interesting to know the National Advisory Panel included representatives from agriculture, mining, forestry, as well as environmental NGOs. And their first recommendation is, in effect, working together as Indigenous peoples with our knowledge systems and Western science. So I don't have time to get into those recommendations, but I think the key point is that it's taken a long time. In '92, we recognized that there was a benefit in working together. And here we are, 2018, and I recently did an opening with the Ministers of Environment from the territories, provinces, and at the federal level. Suffice it to say, this idea of working together is something we're still like seventh grade dance, where the boys sit on one side, the girls sit on the side, and how are we going to do this? We're still at that stage, but at least there's appreciation. And there are examples of the kind of cooperation that will provide a future that will respect the land such that all of our children, no matter what their ancestry is, will benefit. Jimigwich. Yeah, you're welcome.
Forevermore, I'm going to remember Two Eyes Sing. That's a perfect metaphor. Thank you. Now we're going to focus on the dark areas of our map with Justina Ray, whose favorite place to be is 100 miles away from the nearest road. Justina is a wildlife biologist and the founding director of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Justina and her WCS colleagues bring science and their expertise to bear on policy and land use decisions throughout Canada, but particularly in northern boreal and Arctic regions, the dark areas. She served for 9 years as co-chair of the Terrestrial Mammals Subcommittee of COSAWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, which is our Canadian equivalent of the Endangered Species Act. We call it the Species at Risk Act. Justina is a champion for caribou and wolverine. She's also a champion of women in science, motivated by watching the workplace struggles of her own mother a generation earlier. A couple of days ago, I was in Santa Barbara at NC's, where I was working, and I met, and well, I know, and was chatting with a young scientist who many of you probably know, Emily Darling. Emily, are you here? And I mentioned Justina's name, and Emily just started enthusing about, what an incredible mentor Justina has been for her as she's learning the policy and science ropes, and what an outstanding leader you are for so many conservation scientists in Canada. Justina's squirming, but it's true. Justina's idea of success is resolving problems that at first may seem insurmountable, which makes her the perfect co-leader of our conference and our next speaker. Welcome, Justina.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It'll take a little while to recover. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Elder, for welcoming us. Thank you to my co-speakers and the journalists for taking time to be here. And welcome to Toronto. 10 years ago, I walked into an elevator with the CEO of a Canadian mining company, and we were attending the same event celebrating caribou. And he used this occasion to turn to me and say something, it was related to plans about a particular mine, and he just said, what's the problem with a hole in the ground? Why make a big deal about it? The footprint is tiny, and it's a vast wilderness. Scarcely 3 years later, after the mine had been built, the same company put in plans for a second mine about 3 kilometers away and started a new assessment process, almost as if the old one had never happened. So I've often thought about this conversation and the both entitled and somewhat condescending look on the face of the CEO as he sort of patted me on the head, and figuratively, of course, and it's sort of as if to say, there, don't worry about it. This is just a small mine. You don't need to be bothered by it. We've got a lot of land out there. And so in addition to my discovery that day that actually elevator speeches are a thing, and it's probably a good idea for all of us to have a few of them in our back pocket, there was actually, this episode exemplified for me 2 sort of major truths that I've been thinking about over those past 10 years that relate to the conservation future, especially when we look at those dark areas of the map. And the first one is that we as a society and governments in charge take for granted and don't place a ton of value on our natural heritage treasures until they become scarce. And then the second one that this vignette demonstrated to me was that we make decisions only one project at a time. We're seldom proactive where we can be. We never place limits on our activity in advance. And we have an overblown sense of confidence that we will do no harm. So with respect I'm going to talk about both of these in turn. So with respect to the human propensity to take our natural treasures for granted, it's easy to understand why. When you look at this map, a lot of you from the States are like, what are you complaining about? Canada is indeed characterized by vast landscapes of roadless areas, where there's been no significant land conversion in boreal and northern Arctic regions in particular. And if we look at the lights in Canada, I know there's no map, no boundary there, but right at the 49th parallel, we can imagine exactly where that is that we share with the US. And by and large, that reflects where most human settlement is. And it is true what they say, actually, and I looked it up. It is true that I looked up the calculations that about 85 to 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the US border. And although we are the second largest country in the world, we are about the size of the US, but we only have 1/10 of the population. So those statistics are rather sobering. But although we still can't see it here, though, it's important to understand that our footprint extends a great deal further than those lights. And this is reflective of the fact that we're really a natural resource-driven economy. And while not laced with lights, there are many, many, many roads underneath that dark canopy. Resource roads, we're talking about logging roads, seismic roads, transition lines, and so forth, that extend pretty far into the dark, particularly oil and gas footprint in the Western Sedimentary Basin. But still, there is a lot of roadless area. And as for the rest of the dark areas that remain, in spite of our international reputation as like really nice and polite people and lovers of wilderness, make no mistake that Canada is not in this situation because of any foresight, because of any protective instincts on the part of our governments. There have been multiple attempts over the years. In the last 50 years, there have even been commissions and many discussions about how to develop the North. And so we are where we are simply because we haven't gotten there yet. And if we look at the history of human behavior in some ways, that the old expression that you don't know what you've got until it's gone prevails. And while the Atlantic cod story can become kind of a cliche, I have to mention it because it really is such a well-documented example of sort of three major things: an overzealous appetite on our part, the consequences of ignoring solid evidence, warnings in advance year after year, and then also the profound pains of so little progress in restoring this resource after it bottomed out 30 years ago. And as evidenced by our ever-growing list of species at risk, we have all too many species that serve as indicators of deterioration that we don't pay attention to until really it's too late. And we don't have very many good examples of restoring stuff once it's hit bottom. There is good evidence that we should not at this point take any of these intact areas for granted. Namely, that on a global scale, these are becoming more and more scarce. Northern Canada and Alaska actually stand out in the world with an area of intact roadless forests that still occur here. They're at least as large in extent as the Amazon these days, and considerably less fragmented than Asia and Central Africa. And we are losing these intact areas by one measure, 3 million square kilometers over a 15-year period recently. Understanding also, though, is increasing for the disproportionate value of intact forests, namely to biodiversity, carbon, water provision, indigenous culture, maintenance of human health. But in spite of this knowledge and experience, and also that we well know that it makes good business sense to think proactively and strategically, but in advance of problems while we still have them, blah-de-blah-de-blah, that's not how we do things. It's, of course, not how we work when it comes to protecting our natural capital. And decision-making systems reflect this. And I'm not talking about land use planning. Land use planning does occur in a lot of these areas where zoning decisions are made. And these are the dominant and important process in many areas. Generally speaking, though, when land use plans do indicate in a general sense where development is welcomed as opposed to areas where there's going to be protection, they are quite silent and provide no direction on the pace, scale, intensity, complexity, and upper limits of development that the region can tolerate. And this leads me to the second major issue that was raised for me by this meeting with the CEO guy. And that's the reactive and piecemeal manner in which we make decisions about developing an area. And since I'm focusing on these remote areas, this is probably a good time to talk about roads. Access to remote areas is, of course, a prerequisite for any development. You know, if you get transmission, energy, and so on and so forth. Yet, when roads are, and it's not uncommon for agencies, public agencies, to fund and plan and be responsible for building in roads so that they will come, so that you can promote development, so that access is going to be easier. Yet the potential future cumulative effects that will arise are rarely considered, particularly in the face of a changing climate, and the trade-offs between the costs and the benefits from an economic, social, cultural, and ecological impacts are rarely discussed in advance. And so if a road is built for a mine, in most environmental assessment processes, that road will be considered entirely separately from the mine. And where the mine might be subjected to a lengthy environmental assessment, the road kind of gets a sort of a pass. And it's rarely considered. And yet it's those first roads that some of us are calling keystone decisions. They can have disproportionate effects when they're punched through an important area, but they're also growth-inducing. And we're arguing for changes in business as usual practices to where these projects receive major instead of minor consideration and kickstart serious conversations about future scenarios of change in the region. So neither of these two concerns I've raised have changed much in the last 10 years, unfortunately, and since my elevator conversation. And our propensity to take both our intact areas for granted and the state of our business as usual decision-making process are pretty much the same as at that time and remain my biggest worries about the future. But I do want to close by highlighting some important and hopeful shifts in the last 10 years. The first is exemplified by Larry's talk before me and what is referred to in the National Advisory Panel report that he talked about as leadership through reconciliation. This path for conservation recognizes, in the words of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that, quote, reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians from an Aboriginal perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. And this is bolstered by an increasing number of court decisions that have helped define land, treaty, and human rights for Indigenous people in Canada. And the report issued in March by the Indigenous Circle of Experts calls out connections between intact ecological biodiversity and thriving cultural diversity, as well as the turning point we are in history. And while this is, of course, relevant to all of Canada, the dark regions of the map are the homelands of Indigenous peoples who constitute the majority of the human population there. And that's how I'll close, and thank you very much. 27 seconds.
Justina had 3 seconds to spare. She timed herself, you can tell. Okay. Faisal Moola is Associate Professor at the University of Guelph and Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. Faisal is going to speak to the bright spots on our map, the urban to wild connections, and his experiences in the creation of Canada's first urban national park, the Rouge National Urban Park, not far from here. Faisal is one of Canada's most respected conservationists. Prior to joining the University of Guelph, he was Director General for the David Suzuki Foundation in Ontario and Northern Canada, where he helped achieve a lot of policy wins, including the establishment of the world's largest green belt encircling Toronto and the cleanup of mercury poison in Grassy Narrows First Nation. Being a change maker is in Faisal's DNA. His family came to Canada as political dissidents from South Africa because his father was a leading member of the anti-apartheid movement with Nelson Mandela. When they got here, his father decided the family would explore their new home. So they all piled into the family car, and it was Toronto to Tuktoyaktuk. Off they went on a 6,832-kilometer journey. On this trip, Faisal saw his first grizzly, his first caribou, and he ate his first salmon from the mighty Skeena River. He experienced the hospitality of Indigenous communities from Anishinaabe to Cree to Dene and more. The family never made it to Tuk because actually the road ended in Inuvik in those days. But it was this experience that inspired him to complete a PhD in boreal plant ecology and become a strong advocate for Canada's Indigenous-led conservation.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin with a purposely provocative statement. Despite being a vast continent of forests, fields, mountains, and ice, North America is truly an urban society. In Canada, for example, 82% of the population now lives in cities and their suburbs. The percentage of urban dwellers is slightly higher in the United States at 84%, while Mexico sits at 78%. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which tracks global urbanization trends, Canada and the US now rank among the top 50 urbanized nations on the planet, well ahead of other countries like Germany, England, Italy, and most of the other Western European states. Now, the significance of urbanization in Canada and around the world was brought into sharp relief in a series of maps first developed by Timothy Golden, a researcher at the University of Maryland Center for International and Security Studies. And these maps were first published in the Atlantic Monthly and subsequently updated by NASA's Earth Observatory. Using data from the US Defense Meteorological Program at NOAA, Golden identified contiguous lighted areas worldwide. The bright spots on the map behind me reflect sources of light emissions at night. Lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and other largely urban infrastructure which now dominates much of the continent and the planet as a whole. Now, these profound images reveal the extent to which the continent is now fragmented by a mosaic of urban and peri-urban development, crisscrossed with roads, hydro lines, and other infrastructure, and pockmarked with trophy homes, strip malls, and the detritus of our largely urban existence. The pace and scale of urban land use is not only having a devastating impact on biodiversity, but there's something else that's happening. Opportunities for people to experience nature are becoming increasingly limited, as the growth and spread of our urban communities literally consumes the best of the natural world closest to home. For example, a recent analysis by Ducks Unlimited found that over 72% of the original wetlands in southern Ontario, where we are today, have now been developed. Protecting and restoring remaining natural areas in urbanized regions is vitally important, since remnant wetlands, forests, grasslands, and other ecosystems not only provide critical habitat for biodiversity, but these ecosystems also help to sustain the health and well-being of local residents through the suite of ecosystem services that they support. But here's the rub. While public investment in engineered infrastructure, such as transit, sewage and solid waste management, and other built structures and technologies, have come to dominate the public and policy debate around the futures of our cities, a less obvious but equally valuable asset of our cities and suburbs, urban natural capital, such as ravines and city parks, healthy waterways and street trees, have received comparatively little political attention or government funding until recently. I don't need to tell you how important urban natural capital is, from remnant ecosystems to street trees to engineered green infrastructure like green walls and bioswales. Natural and engineered ecosystems extend the life of many types of traditional infrastructure by assisting, for example, with stormwater management. Urban natural capital provides habitat for biodiversity, like pollinators, and it helps to mitigate extreme heat and air pollution, which threatens the health of our most vulnerable citizens, our young and our elderly. It also provides psychological and restorative benefits for urban dwellers, such as stress relief. And yet, while leafy neighborhoods still exist in older and wealthier and whiter communities in major cities across the continent, such as Toronto and Chicago, most urban areas remain effectively deforested. Studies have suggested that a minimum of 30% natural cover is required for the provision of critical ecosystem services in urban areas. Toronto is Canada's most forested city. We're at 28% canopy cover. But the distribution of street trees and urban infrastructure and green space is far from equitable. It's as low as 5% in many lower income and racialized neighborhoods in the city, and the same is happening across the continent. The consequences of this decline and degradation of urban nature are far-reaching. They include higher built infrastructure costs associated with managing stormwater management and greater vulnerability to natural disturbances such as floods and storms, as we learned with Hurricane Sandy. Furthermore, new research also shows that people living in neighborhoods lacking in mature trees and other green infrastructure face increased rates of cardiovascular disease and other health risks. For example, a U.S. Forest Service study found that the widespread infestation of urban forests and tree-lined streets by the emerald ash borer, an invasive insect, has not only killed tens of millions of urban trees, but it's contributing to higher rates of death from cardiovascular and lower respiratory illness among urban dwellers. This is the first and third most common causes of death in the United States. Now, the direct relationship between urban trees and human health is not fully understood, but researchers believe people living in urban areas are less active, suffer from greater stress levels, and are exposed to poorer air quality in neighborhoods that lack green infrastructure. This is especially problematic in lower income and racialized communities. Conversely, urban trees are so efficient at removing airborne pollutants like carbon monoxide, lead, and nitrogen dioxide, among other benefits, that in a recent study published in Nature Scientific Reports, my co-authors and I found that having just 10 more trees on a city block, on average, improves public health outcomes in ways comparable to an increase in annual personal income by $10,000 or being 7 years younger. Thankfully, motivated by clear evidence of the biodiversity, green infrastructure, and demonstrated eco-health benefits of urban nature, governments have begun to catch up to the enormous value of sustaining and growing the stock of urban natural capital in and around our cities. For example, the cities and suburbs of southern Ontario are literally wrapped in a great green cloak of protected forests, wetlands, and other types of ecosystems called the Greenbelt. Established in 2005, the Greenbelt is the largest zone of protected urban and peri-urban nature on the planet. It stretches over 2 million acres, and it provides critical habitat for over a third of the regulated species at risk in the province of Ontario, where we are today, from Blanding's turtles to woodland voles. More recently, the federal government of Canada established the country's first urban national park, called Rouge National Urban Park, in the heart of Canada's largest and most ethnically diverse metropolitan area, on the eastern edge of the city. Rouge National Urban Park is also found within the ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and their Indigenous neighbours, whose members include Elder Gary Sue, who opened today's plenary with a prayer. Thank you, Elder. Rouge National Park is 23 times larger than Central Park in New York City. It is home to over 1,700 species of plants and animals. The park's remarkable biodiversity includes a diverse array of trees, understory plants, and animals of the rare Carolinian life zone, which in Canada only exists in southern Ontario, including rare and imperiled species such as cucumber tree, American ginseng, and a Canadian flycatcher. The diverse assemblage of remnant old forests, thickets, meadows, wetlands, marshes, and agricultural fields also provides an opportunity for nearby residents, most who are among recent immigrants to Canada, and also a number of large refugee communities, to experience nature without having to travel a great distance from home. The park was established in 2015 under the Rouge National Urban Park Act and amended last year to strengthen the legislation to ensure that ecological integrity is the first priority in the park's management. Despite these positive steps, the future of Rouge National Urban Park and a number of our other urban and peri-urban protected green spaces remain unresolved. There's essentially three questions. Are these wilderness areas where priority is given to the restoration and maintenance of ecological integrity, consistent with how other national parks are managed within the federal park systems in Canada? Or are they people parks, as the former Conservative government leader Stephen Harper originally branded Rouge National Urban Park, an urban oasis that provides easy access to nature and opportunities for residents to experience recreational opportunities? Or is there an opportunity to find a balance between these two visions? A holistic approach which encourages and promotes stewardship, recognizing that these urban protected areas will flourish not in spite of, but because of the presence of people. To conclude, Canadians have always celebrated the spectacular natural beauty that makes ours one of the most beautiful and prosperous nations on the planet. From oceans and coastlines to mountains and foothills to prairies and grasslands to urban green space such as the new Rouge Urban National Park. Parks and protected areas protect our country's biological richness and offer Canadians and visitors alike places for respite and solitude in nature. However, conservation in urbanized regions is complex and it's challenging. The lessons from the creation of Canada's first urban national park in the Rouge is that we will need to design and implement solutions that address multiple needs, including habitat for biodiversity, green infrastructure, and the health and well-being of local residents. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Larry, Justina, and Faisal. Now, you've all been sitting there listening to this, and each individual, everybody's taking away something different. The next part of our program is going to help you think like a journalist a little bit. Like, what are these people who've come here who are not steeped in conservation to the degree that we are, who are really proxies for the decision makers and the public that we would really like to influence? What are they getting from this? So I'd like to invite Ivan and Kendra to come up and join us. What a gentleman. Thanks. Okay. So why do we bring journalists to these conferences? Well, of course, for the obvious reasons that we hope that they'll tell stories to the wider world. But they also really can play a role in helping us think differently, maybe lift the lid on our own thinking a little bit and give it a broader context. Journalists are professional question askers. They're curious, nosy for a living. They're really good at figuring out what their audiences, the general public and decision makers, would want to know more about on the topics that we're discussing. They can cut to the chase, and they offer a reality check, thinking about the social and political contexts. And they can bring in outside perspectives that can help us consider how do we carry these messages out of the conference to the people and the places where they can make a difference. So I'm going to ask them in just a minute to react to what they just heard. First of all, I'd like to introduce Ivan Semenuk. Anybody who lives in Canada probably knows his name because he's the one and only science reporter at the Globe and Mail, our national newspaper. He lives and works here in Toronto, and in his past lives, he was U.S. news director for Nature magazine and was based in Washington, D.C. He's lived in Boston, where he worked for New Scientist, and he also was a producer and columnist with Discovery Channel Canada here in Toronto. He was the 2016 recipient of the Royal Canadian Institute Sanford Fleming's Medal for Contributions to the Public Understanding of Science. He describes himself on his Twitter feed as a journalist covering the universe of ideas and the people who think them, which is why I'm always trying to rope him into our Compass events, and I'm so thrilled that he's here with us at NACCB. I'll go straight to Kendra. As well, Kendra may be familiar to some of you. You might have met her in Madison. At the time, she was working for Popular Science, and she told me something that has stuck with me. At another Compass event, Kendra, you told me that Popular Scientist goes to all the jails across the land. And so it was that was one of the audiences that she had in mind when she was writing her stories. She recently landed at the New York Times, where she covers climate. And she's written a book called Greenwashed: Why We Can't Buy Our Way to a Green Planet, which makes her perfect discussant for our theme of connecting the urban to the wild. Kendra was born and raised in Queens, New York. Queens is not only New York City's and the country's most ethnically diverse, though often least appreciated borough, it also, she tells me, teems with biological diversity. In fact, she credits her interest in the environment, at least in part, to the cicadas she heard outside her bedroom as a child. Their molted shell remains haunted her nightmares. Kendra firmly believes everyone should be fortunate enough to be both awed and terrified by nature on a semi-regular basis. So I want to invite Ivan and Kendra to tell us what struck them about what they just heard. Who are you thinking of when you're listening to this about who your audience is? And what do you think would be most interesting to them? Where might you go with this? As the hometown person, Ivan, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Thanks to the organizers of the meeting. Thank you, Elder, for all the work you've done to create a forum where we can have this conversation. So I am the science reporter for the Globe and Mail, although I have overlap in coverage of environment from various perspectives with others of my colleagues at the Globe and Mail. I'm not sure if everyone in Canada has heard of me, so if you're elsewhere in the world and you meet a Canadian, don't say, "Hey, do you know Ivan?" I don't think it's going to work, but if it does, let me know. So, Nancy was talking about how journalists see the world, and of course we are question askers, and we're obviously looking for stories. We're looking for ways that we can help reveal the world maybe in a new way or in a more relevant way to our readers. And so in a sense, as I was listening to these excellent opening talks and thinking, what is the unifying theme here? I was thinking in terms of disconnects, ways in which I think that my readers, or I perceive that my readers might not be in the same place where the professional conservation biology community is. And in that disconnect, there could be avenue for storytelling and for reporting to try to help people understand the way the world is now, as opposed to perhaps the preconceived ideas that people have built up or what they're gathering from the media in different ways. So I'll keep it short and simple to just say that I've come up with a list of 3 disconnects, each of which I see opportunities for storytelling from a Canadian perspective, but I think they also apply more universally as well. Disconnect number 1 comes from Larry's talk, and I think this is especially relevant in Canada, and it's something that I've become aware of in the last couple of years and become curious about. I'm a journalist who's comfortable covering Western science. I mean, I spend most of my time in a room. I spend most of my time talking to scientists, and that's how I distinguish myself from many of my colleagues in the newsroom who find that a little bit daunting. I love being in a room full of scientists. The more complicated the conversation, the better. However, I think for our readers, and broadly across Canada, there may be a sense that this kind of dialogue with Indigenous people about co-governance, co-stewardship of the country is just starting. I think for many of our readers, there's an awareness of that is just starting. The idea of reconciliation is relatively new for many people, and it's something that has kind of come into the news more with our Canada 150 celebrations from last year. What's interesting about Larry's talk to me is how many miles and how many years have already gone into that dialogue, and how far scientists in particular, as a professional unit, have gone along that dialogue, thinking about the interplay between indigenous knowledge and Western science and data gathering, and also thinking about how those two domains of knowledge talk to each other and can reinforce each other. I did a story last fall that really showed this to me, where across the Mackenzie River Basin, which is about a quarter of Canada, the watershed that's almost a quarter of Canada's land area, how little data there is from Western science for so much of that watershed. There just aren't enough scientists, there's not enough funding. You know, this is a vast area where we really don't know what the norms are in terms of the environment at a time when everything's changing. It's clear that Indigenous knowledge from this vast area is vital, because it's the only knowledge available, and also it's knowledge that can add a different perspective to what science. So I could see scientists taking that seriously, and I realized that years of thinking had gone into that. I think there's a disconnect there between the audience, which thinks, oh, we're just starting this conversation, where do we even go with it, not realizing how evolved and sophisticated that conversation has become. Disconnect number 2 from Justina's talk, maybe a little bit more subtle, but I think the Kinder Morgan pipeline story which has been playing out, especially in the last few months, really illustrates how, for most readers, and in the cliche of how we tell these stories, it's so often presented as a zero-sum game, like between environmentalists and industry, between various, interest groups that are trying to play that tug-of-war of conservation versus development, and portrayed in that kind of zero-sum way. Justina beautifully showed how different reality is. That, of course, there are tensions, of course it's a game, but it's a kind of optimization game that's really going on. That this idea of, what is an effective strategy for development, for long-term stewardship, and how do the various very different factors that play into what matters to us about our country, about our landscape, what are the factors that play into this kind of optimization algorithm? And that the real questions often are not what happens, of course it boils down to the road or the mine or the forest, but it's really these policy structures that might inhibit optimization, and where are they getting in the way? And I have 1 minute left, so disconnect number 3 from Faisal is this sense, I think, that many of our readers have, or that I have even, is that these are questions that are removed from us, that, the wilderness is somewhere far away. Maybe if we're lucky, we might get into part of it for our summer vacation, something like that, but mostly it's happening out of sight, out of mind, and we really have no idea what's going on up there. But of course, the emphasis that we're an urban society primarily, and that we actually depend on access to nature even for health and well-being, an overlooked idea, kind of brings people into the picture of environmental stewardship in a more direct, more immediate way. So there's another disconnect there. So that's sort of my overarching reflection of that, but plenty of room for storytelling in all of those directions. And I think a surprise for many how current all of this is, and how rapidly we're accumulating new knowledge in all of those fronts.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Kendra.
Okay. Oh, so it is on. So before I get into what these guys were talking about, I want to do a quick breakdown on sort of the 2 kinds of stories that we tend to think about. And one is sort of just a news story, which is you have a study coming out or a report coming out, and it's important in some way, and we might write 500 to 700 words on it, and it's pretty simple and straightforward. So like most recently, I did a story on Arctic geese that are having problems adjusting with, like when it's warmer in the spring earlier, they like fly faster. And so they use kind of a new tracker to like track their speed, which was kind of cool. But they're still not able to, so they're moving from like the Netherlands to the Arctic. When spring arrives earlier, they sort of don't stop. They don't take rest stops. But then when they get to the Arctic, they have to eat because they haven't been eating, and so it doesn't actually there's no net benefit. It still delays when they lay eggs. 500 words out the door, pretty simple. People love animal stories, so and it's kind of a sad animal story, like a semi-sad animal story, so it was an easy sell, not much thought. But sorry, that's the truth.
We killed to get that.
So on the other side are sort of like longer feature-length things, which for the Times newspaper is usually around 1,400 words. If you're writing for a magazine, it can go 3,000 to 5,000 words, and some even as long as 10,000 words if you're lucky enough to be like a feature writer for Nat Geo. And that's sort of the vein in which I was thinking of the stuff that you guys were saying today was more longer-term feature and not like a short news study. And so for that, the first thing that I really was thinking about a lot of was like, well, what's the story? Like, I think, Larry, you had a lot of really great and interesting sort of like facts and nuggets about this process, but there were two things that were sort of tripping me up. One was a default expectation that we sort of understood that Indigenous knowledge is important and valid, and you're lucky enough, I guess, to be sitting at the table with two people who sort of believe that, but not all reporters have much knowledge of those. And so just sort of an example of like a community where, and I think the elder said it earlier when he was talking about restocking that lake and how by using traditional knowledge they were able to bring back the fish in this lake. That's sort of the thing where it's like, oh, that's what you're talking about, and that's a story that I can hook sort of all of the other things you were telling me around that. And so that also gets into like, why does it matter and who does it affect? Because we can't always assume, I generally assume that, especially now that I just cover climate change, I assume that nobody wants to read what I'm writing. My Twitter handle is gloom is my beat. And so I work really hard to, I don't want to say deceive people, but I will go as far as my editors will let me before I let people know that like the culprit is climate change. I want them to get really invested. And so that also sort of ties into what I think Justina was saying when she was talking about the fragmentation of the ecosystems. I didn't know the mine that you're referencing and sort of that big lens. It would have been helpful to also just have a story or an example to sort of hang that onto as well. I'm just going through. But I really liked I think you said if a road is built for a mine, the environmental review part. I just would have loved an example of like a mine that sort of got a pass in that capacity, because that helps. So that's the other thing is like as reporters, I can come up with an idea, but you have to sell me, and then once you sell me, I have to sell it to an editor. And so I can love a piece and love a story. Like, so I'm working on a story now that I actually pitched in January, and my editor didn't say no right away, but I couldn't convince her until June. And so it took me 6 months to convince her to do this story, but only because I was really committed and passionate about it that it got that far. Like, there are stories that I've just let go because I didn't feel personally that it was worth it. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I don't want to get scooped. And then Faisal, when you were talking about the urban national park, the thing that blew my mind was the comparison size to Central Park. That's really helpful when you're talking about size. Nobody knows how big an acre or a hectare is. So if you have an easy comparison, that's really great. And so the first thing I was thinking was, how the heck did you convince Toronto to build a park 25 times the size of Central Park? As a New Yorker, that completely stood out to me, and I really love that. I actually wrote, how the hell? Yeah, I did. And I also was sort of wondering about the 10 more trees on a block confers ecosystem benefits. But one of the other things, and this sort of ties into it, is a lot of people don't really know what biodiversity is, and finding sort of, I was talking recently to a seagrass researcher, and she gave me this beautiful example that I have no use for, but I'm working on it, which was in Indonesia. They found that seagrasses filter out 50% of the human contaminants that end up in the surrounding waterways, and this is in an area where oftentimes raw sewage ends up in the ocean in the same place people are fishing. And so that's a compelling fact as to the direct ecosystem benefit. And so I would have loved an example of, and you sort of touched on it with the urban trees, but more so with the park, because you're clearly 25 times the size of Central Park. You really have to convince people, I feel like. And I think, yeah. Oh, and then this is just a thing for me. I like weird things, I like funny things, and I like surprising things. So if you can give me all of those, that's great. I worked on a story that it's my first animal story at the Times, and I didn't think it would be that successful or whatever, just because it was about beavers moving into the Arctic. I swear I don't just write Arctic stories. But I used the phrase that the problem wasn't just that beavers are moving into the Arctic, but because they build the dams, they add a lot of water to the ecosystem, which thaws the permafrost. So it's a much larger problem than just as a signal of climate change. And so I use the phrase, it's not that they're moving into the Arctic, but that they're gentrifying it. And people went bananas. And so, like, again, funny and very, like, evocative. People instantly knew what I meant. And so that's just generally helpful. And sometimes if you can give that to me instead of making me work for it, all the better.
Okay, you're greasing the wheels for the conversations to come with the journalists perfectly. So one of the questions I had was, how do you think we can best amplify the insights of all of you and maybe have them heard? So you saw the thinking, Ivan's thinking very analytically in terms of disconnects about where people are at and where are things really, and how do you bring those two things closer together. Kendra is talking about the importance of the rich example, the story, the ways in, all the different ways into stories, funny, just things you've never thought of, surprise her, and things that may be new to you, or things that are not new to you are often new to others. So it's having that beginner's mind is a super helpful thing. So I wanted to ask, I wanted to give you guys a chance to ask questions, including the journalists as well as you, or to briefly react to what you've heard. I didn't think of this until now, but I really hate when you have microphones like that, and I'm wondering if I could ask my Compass colleagues, Megan and Amanda, to each take a microphone, and you can put up your hands so you don't have to go stand in a line, and ask a question or of our panel along the theme of, the road ahead. How do we best make progress on achieving conservation, or ask them questions about what you've just heard and something that just really provoked you and is on your mind. So we share and cross-pollinate. All right, anybody have a question for our hand up? Okay, Megan, if you just go, and then if you could just please introduce yourself and keep it to, if it's more than 30 seconds, so I'm gonna have my little laser.
Hello. Yeah, it's on. My name's Stephanie Miller. I'm from the Northern Arizona University. I'm a PhD student. And why I raised my hand so quickly is I kind of picked up something pretty in the moment almost. So I noticed that everybody in some ways used either a personal story or humor to kind of bring us in. And I think about science communication because I think that's where we are as researchers. And so I would like to hear more specifically from the scientists, but also the journalist can kind of comment. What did you hear, and when they were kind of discussing what your stories or your talks, what did you hear that reminded you of your working process when you think about problems or when you're approaching a new question? Or I see there's a lot of commonality in journalists or writers and scientists in terms of how we think about constructing our story and our research. And yeah.
So, Ivan, you want to take a crack at that?
I'll just, so you've identified something that journalists are looking for all the time. Their ears are pricking up whenever there's a story or an anecdote. The reason that is, I think, is that stories are a terrific tool for commanding attention. They're a vehicle for commanding attention, and that actually then translates into imprinting memory. If there's a memorable anecdote, if there's a memorable character in a story, odds are higher that the salient facts about that story will be retained. That's my takeaway from writing hundreds and hundreds of stories in different media over the years. They can't be gratuitous, they have to be relevant, but I think it's also the way we've learned to communicate with each other. It's the way language is structured from a time before text. I guess the question is how to turn that into information that can tell us something about a much bigger picture that's beyond one person. And so it's often for us, and this is something for scientists in the room to think about, you're all a story, you all have a unique perspective on a very, very big picture, and often looking through your eyes is the way to see something about that big picture that's not as good. There may not be a better perspective. There's a reason why Harry Potter is told from the perspective of an 11-year-old student and not the headmaster of the college. It provides a perspective on the front line of that story that you don't get otherwise. So all of you are in that potential situation, so you need to let us see the world through your eyes.
And something we see always and often with scientists is there is a tendency to fly at 30,000 feet and speak in generalities. So if you can find that telling example, that vignette, that little thing that happened that exemplifies the bigger story, that's how you get people in and to take them where you're going. Faisal and then Justina.
Sure, I just talk. Well, for me, I came to the realization pretty early on that all the facts with none of the flavor is not only really boring, but it's a missed opportunity to engage the public and, by extension, policymakers. And in much of my work, which is around trying to make conservation relevant to decision makers, it was really, really clear that we had to be able to speak to policymakers in a way that not only made them care very personally about the issue, but also something that they could see themselves in, that there could be some personal ownership in terms of themselves as an actor in the conservation solution. So for example, with Rouge Urban National Park, one of the most remarkable comments that I ever heard was the former member of parliament for the Rouge, who is a member of the Tamil community. And she told me, she said, Faisal, they are children in some of the lower income communities in the east side of Toronto that have never experienced flowing water other than when they turn on the tap to brush their teeth or wash their face. And that if we get this, an urban national park, which is protected and saved from the threat of urban sprawl, and then we make efforts to engage the local primarily immigrant communities and provide access, we can do something that's going to be just absolutely remarkable, not just for biodiversity, but also in terms of actually creating a constituency that has historically been alienated from conservation for caring about biodiversity. So I think storytelling is absolutely critical in terms of the work that you do as a scientist.
Thank you. Justina.
I just wanted to make the point that it depends entirely on who your audience is. So for this, although there were journalists there, and it turns out I was speaking to them, I really was speaking to the broader audience in the knowledge that there were probably going to be a lot of people in the room that were not necessarily aware of Canadian processes and so the story, as I developed the points that I wanted to make in the room, I kept going back in my head to that one story of the elevator, my elevator story, and so then I ended up using it as a framing to start the conversation with all of you. I would not have done that with a journalist because it would have been kind of too meandering. Instead, I would use stories more to illustrate points and add more color to them as we would be talking, which would be hopefully more than 10 minutes. And also in knowledge about how much context that reporter would be likely to know. So I would be telling the story very differently to Kendra versus Ivan, who, I've tried to tell lots of stories to in the past, for better or worse. But I'm really, really familiar with his work, so I have an idea about the kind of stuff that he's excited about and interested in. So that puts you at a different place than somebody whose work you really don't know. You don't know that much background to them. And so you have to tell the story and use the stories in a very different way.
Thank you. Larry, is there anything you'd like to add on this storytelling theme?
Yeah, I'm thinking many things, including how we understand. I'm thinking about a statement made by a Western scientist who said, 30 years of good science, and I'm going to shorten it, dealing with the most pressing environmental problems. And he mentioned habitat destruction, species loss, and climate change. And he said, after 30 years of good science, I feel like we need a transformation, a cultural and spiritual transformation. And that's very, very, I'm hearing, from a journalistic point of view, how do you capture your audience? And it's interesting that Goal A and the first Aichi target are about mainstreaming biodiversity to government and society, and that we all need to understand how our life is connected to biodiversity. And I think about that. I see that as a core responsibility we share as human beings. And I think about how I was brought up and the ceremonies we have, and the ceremonies that we had in the Pathways 1 process, which was about connecting. It was about going beyond the mental and physical world, and it was about the emotional and spiritual world. That when you're able to empathize with all of creation, then you don't look at a tree as with bored feet and dollar signs. That you relate to it in a different way. And so that's a big challenge. That's what our ancestors in 1764 were trying to do, and I would say still trying to do. And even in our own communities with our own youth, that's part of the challenge that we have. So the story that we tell is supposed to evoke intelligence from those four sources. From our mental capacities, from the physical world, from our heart, and from our spirit. And when we accomplish that, then we transform how we're looking at the same thing.
Thank you. Kendra, do you have any last thoughts before we go to our next question? Next question. Oh.
Hi, I'm also a PhD student from Minnesota. And I'm really curious, so I think this has been a theme in what a lot of you have mentioned, but the importance of knowing your audience as well as finding those things that are kind of surprising or new or exciting to captivate that audience. And I'm wondering if any of you have tips for getting to know your audience and how to sort of identify those things in our work, in our own scientific work, that we spend so much time thinking about, and how to find those things that are new and exciting to that audience. I think that can be a real challenge to pick out the right level of information and to find those nuggets, I guess.
Do you go to parties with non-scientists? So when you tell them about your work, A, the things that you feel most inclined to tell them, and B, the things that don't immediately have them looking for the bathroom or the onion dip, are probably things that are interesting to people outside of your discipline, at least as an entryway into what you're doing.
Who do you think of as your audience when you're writing, Ivan?
It may depend on the story, but I mean, our audience broadly is Canada at large and the world even. Obviously, we're looking at the world from a bit of a Canadian perspective. I really am thinking of all of those front porches, even though people are mainly I used to think about all those front porches where the paper would land. Increasingly, I'm thinking about all of those times where someone takes a mobile phone out of their pocket and just thinking about all the different possible people that might be. And so I have to say that my answer to that question is fluid right now because I want to make sure I'm not just going for the same audience all the time, but trying to be more inclusive and thinking about all the possible reaches. But I think Kendra's advice is also extremely relevant. I also am thinking about, if I have a conversation, say with, when the parents of a friend of one of my daughters comes over to pick up after a party or something, and I start talking about what I'm doing at work, what is it that they find interesting about a story? Or anywhere else, if I'm, on a plane or just talking to someone, where I'm just having a random conversation with someone on the street, what things people say that might, and if I share something about what I'm doing, what attracts their interest. So it's a very personal thing.
So all three of Larry, Justina, and Faisal are very skilled communicators. What do you think about, how do you know thy audience?
Well, for me, it's my mom. And one of the reasons for it's my mom is because she was so disappointed when I decided to do a PhD in ecology, as opposed to, I think, become a doctor, an engineer, or whatever. But I remember, trying to relate, my passions about conservation to the experience of being outdoors. And she responded sort of glibly saying, well, Faisal, brown people like us, we don't camp, we picnic. And now that's not totally true, but there is a nugget of truth there, which is that for a lot of the audiences that I think we need to think about, some of these far-flung intact areas, there's just no way that is going to have any relevance to them and their own lives. And so it's really critical for us to be able to make some of the things that we're doing work on, be it Jeremy's work on pollinators and the importance of endangered species and such, relevant to audiences that may not necessarily have the privilege. And I really want us to think about this. We are privileged to be able to experience and spend time in these incredibly amazing places. The vast majority of residents in Canada, in the US, in Mexico will never have that opportunity. So there has to be an attempt. It behooves us to try to make these ideas and these concepts as relevant to them within their zone of influence and their zone of experience. So with regards to go back to my mom, I'll just end it really quickly. In our community, we would have these picnics, extremely large family affairs. We would gorge ourselves on food. At the end of the meal, the matriarch would get up and say, let's go out and work off the meal by going for a walk in the woods. And it wasn't about being intentional about experiencing nature and seeing biodiversity, but we still had those experiences because of the fact that we were going out further afield. And that is as relevant and as important as going out on a 2-week, 3-week backcountry camping trip and seeing grizzly bears and caribou and all those wondrous animals.
Thanks.
I have to add one more thing. I just realized in my answer that I left out. Okay, real quick. When I was talking about, talking to all, people in the community and so on, there is one audience I do have in mind when it comes to this kind of story, and that is the people in the Prime Minister's office or in the Premier's office. For this kind of policy story, I am definitely thinking about that audience too, because if there are relevant facts that should not be ignored, I'm asking myself, how do I write this in a way that it can't be ignored? So I left that out.
Thanks. Juliet Alpern, who works at the Washington Post and does a lot of stuff with us, says, whenever I write anything, I'm thinking of the president. That's her N=1. Okay, was there another question over here? Thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much. My name is Arun Dayanandan. I'm the founding president of the Montreal chapter of SCB, and I'm a biology graduate student at Concordia University in Montreal. So I actually had a question. So in the past, we've seen that many scientists have thought, hey, you know, the science should tell the story, the data is enough, and that's it. And thankfully, that's changed. We've seen a trend now that, as we see in this room, scientists are actually speaking with journalists, and now journalists are telling the story. But I've also noticed that there can be a trend towards, well, the story should be enough. The story is going to, you know, tell everything that needs to be, and people will come to the stories. And that is true to a certain extent, as we've just spoken about with the previous question. But I've found that tends to lead to certain kinds of stories being repeated, the same way that certain kinds of science have been repeated, you know, that are easy to pick up on, something cute and fuzzy, or something with, you know, almost a David versus Goliath type story, hero's journey. But how do we tell those stories that aren't necessarily easy to tell to family members, you know, at the dinner table, or that might not capture the imagination but are still very important in the context of conservation?
Reflections on that?
Yeah, so I think I said this, but I'm not sure, but I have a no sea level rise rule where I try to really, really heavily avoid stories about climate change and sea level rise, because it tends to isolate people who don't live on the coast. They're like, we get it. And we actually get a lot of mail from readers who are like, I don't live on the coast and this doesn't affect me, or I kind of don't care if it affects you. And so I'm fair. And so to answer your question, like, you're right, we do fall into these traps of these very sort of easy to tell stories because the narrative is one that we're really familiar with. And so there are some ways of doing it. One way that's really beneficial is, this isn't quite conservation, it's pollution, but I did a story about, and it was all old research, but it was about the fact that in the United States, people who live in segregated communities experience higher levels of pollution than people who live in more integrated communities. Now, we've all heard a variation of the story, which is essentially that, like, poor brown and black people, or even middle class, just brown and black people, tend to live in really polluted communities. But this is also true of white people. So if you're a white person who lives in a segregated community, you will experience higher levels of pollution than a white person who lives in a more integrated community. And I was talking to this researcher about this purely because I thought it was interesting. I didn't have a story or a peg. And she said something that was just like, I don't know if I don't communicate it well, but this part of the story never gets reported on. The poor black and brown people part always gets reported on. And there is a 50th year anniversary. We were doing a big spread at the Times on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I knew enough about King to know that he had talked a bit about how segregation was also bad. Not just for black people, but for white people doing the segregating. And so I made it a peg to this anniversary story as a way of getting that information out to the public. And so there are ways that but I feel like it has to be, yes, there are ways of, like, sort of separating or telling those stories differently, but it takes a little bit more work, and you have to think a little bit more about sort of like, how do you peg this to something that people will read?
Thank you. Now, I am mindful that it's getting very close to the time for us to start drinking and talking. And so I just want to very quickly, before I allow the journalists to introduce themselves, to thank Larry and Justina and Faisal for their wonderful talks. And maybe just in, like, a very short statement, let's end on a hopeful note. Can you share with us what gives you hope as you look ahead? Oh dear.
I'm very hopeful by what Larry and Elder Gary shared. I think that we're in a remarkable time where there's finally a recognition of the historical role of Indigenous peoples in terms of stewarding the planet and the benefits that we get from the planet. And finally, there seems to be a recognition on the part of policymakers in terms of equity, the fact that Indigenous-led systems of conservation are as important, if not more important, than some of the traditional strategies that we've used to protect biodiversity.
I would echo that, and I would also say, you young people, God, I'm old now, which is you know, the graduate students, the questions you're asking, we didn't really ask then. We just sort of got stuck in our hole, and and then we emerged at some point. But it's really important for the action and activity to be starting younger, and that gives me hope. Thanks.
Larry.
On Friday at Murphy's Point Provincial Park, we launched a birch bark canoe. And in doing it, we talked about how that canoe teaches us a connection to the land. And there was between 150 and 200 people, some of who knew this was happening. We formed a big circle. And we did a smudging ceremony. We passed the eagle feather, and people spoke whatever they needed to say. And the park ecologist, I'll just call him Toby, was the one who got the funding organized, took the risks to make all of this happen. And for 2 weeks, literally thousands of people who visited the park spent time with Chuck Commanda and hearing about the canoe and what it means to him and the connection to the land and water. And it was, and I found that people afterwards came to us and expressed how they'd never been involved in a ceremony like that before and how much they learned. And there's more to this story about connecting with the frogs and just listening to hear the voices of the land. It was so great, just people from all walks of life. Speaking of not knowing your audience, they came from all over. So there was probably and different income strata and so on. But just the feedback gave me hope that people are ready for a different way to approach our sacred responsibilities. Thank you. Miigwech.
Please join me in thanking Larry, Justina, and Faisal for officially kicking off our conference. Now, you might want to go back and sit down there because there's going to be a big parade going by here right now. I'm wondering if it would work best with the microphone, the handheld mic. I'm just going to ask each of the journalists to come up, and so you can put a face to the name. Now, in the interest of know thy audience, they're going to tell you who they are and what they're really interested in talking about in no more than 3 sentences. And you can listen, and you can then do your homework at some point. Just quickly Google them on the phone, find out, a little bit more about them, start a conversation. And we're going to incentivize this because they actually have drink tickets for people who particularly, they don't have that many, but they have a few select drink tickets to, as carrots for you to come and talk to them, to hand out at the following lecture. So, Eric, if you would just start and just come up here, just say who you are, and you can just start forming a line and just come on this side and off the other. And I'll get out of the way.
Okay, my name's Eric Vance. That's a little out of date, actually. I write for Scientific American and National Geographic and other sort of glossy magazines. I'm interested in conservation. I'm newly arrived from Mexico City. I've been there for 7 years, and I've kind of forgot what's going on in the U.S. So I'm interested in jumping in, and then also if anyone has a Latin American story, I'll go back.
Hi, I'm Nikki Wilson. I'm from Jasper, Alberta, and I write about everything from bacteria in the permafrost to bison. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about anything you want to talk about. I work alone. I don't see people a lot sometimes, so I'll try not to touch your arm. And in addition to the drink tickets, I've also been to 2 great restaurants in the past 2 days that I would be happy to share with you if you come talk to me.
Okay.
They clearly
It's a
don't.
little long, but we have a broadcast person.
They clearly don't know that we're journalists if they're telling us we have to give away our drink tickets. Talk about know thy audience, Nancy. My name is Ashley Ahern. I've been a science and environment reporter for NPR and member stations around the country for the past more than 10 years now. Recently hosted and produced a podcast called Terrestrial about the personal choices we make in the face of climate change. And now I've started my own production company, podcast production company. And I am really excited to be here just because my heart leaps when I see the sound waves bump from the passion in your voices. So I'm here to meet passionate scientists to talk about podcasting and any questions you have about how to tell your story better.
Thank you. 3 sentences.
Thank
It's
you.
a long line.
Susan Moran, a freelance journalist in Boulder, Colorado. And here, well, as a print, and then also I do a radio science show. So here for possible interviews and anything really cool stuff you're doing, I'm super interested in. And then the role of ag in energy development and food and biodiversity conservation and all kinds of things. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Hannah Hogue. I'm a reporter here in Toronto. As a journalist, I'm interested in stories about the Arctic, climate change, food security, people and their relationship with nature. I'm also an editor, the Environment and Energy editor at The Conversation Canada. So I am interested in having you tell your stories to the rest of Canada and having me help you shape those.
I'm Jennifer Weeks. I'm the Environment and Energy Editor for The Conversation US. So I am interested in meeting anyone who is at a US college or university and wants to write their own story about their work or commentary, or has PhD students or postdocs who they think would like to learn to do that.
Hi, I'm Ann Castleman. I am most interested in writing about visceral examples of human coexistence with nature. 2, the intersection between science and Indigenous ways of knowledge, which is a big theme here. And 3, because the last thing I wrote was about climate change preparedness in Canada, and it was quite depressing for my own emotional well-being. I would say if you have a happy story, you should probably flag it for me as well.
Hi, I'm Katie Lang, and I'm a reporter at Science Magazine. We love stories about new scientific discoveries, policy. We also run stories about diversity and careers in science. So please come talk to me about any one of those topics or anything else, really.
Hi, I'm Molly Siegel. I'm a radio journalist. I'm an independent radio journalist, so I file for different national CBC shows, NPR, and podcasts. I file for a general audience, but I also file for science-specific shows. So I look for stories that have tension. So what's driving your work forward right now? And is it part of a larger community? And yeah, who else can I talk to for this story? And can you take me somewhere? Because that's fun for radio.
I'm Leslie Evans-Ogden. I'm a freelance journalist based in Vancouver, and you can check out the places I write for online. My conservation curiosity is wide-ranging, but I'm interested in success stories in conservation, fragmentation, conservation psychology, lots of other areas. And there's one extra reason why you should come and talk to me, and that is because I have an extra drink ticket left over from my last Compass Fellowship.
Hey, I'm Ben Goldfarb. I'm a writer in Spokane, Washington, so Northwesterners, come find me. Right now I'm very interested in transportation ecology. I also just wrote a book about beavers, aka Arctic gentrifiers. Kendra, I heard your slander there. Well, we're gonna talk later. So roads and rodents, those are my interests. Come find me.
Hi, I'm Larry Pinn. I cover environment for the Vancouver Sun and Province newspapers in British Columbia. And so I'm interested in anything terrestrial or marine that affects British Columbia, including cross-border issues, southern resident killer whales, for example. I'm interested in that. But although I work for the papers full-time, I'm also a frequent contributor to Hawkeye online magazine. If you're not familiar with it, it's HAKAI, and it's absolutely amazing magazine. And it talks about marine issues all over the world. So we won't be limited by British Columbia. If you have anything that you're working on globally, marine environment, for sure, I want to hear from you.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Giller, a freelance journalist based in Ithaca, New York. And my particular interest is reptiles and amphibians, especially salamanders. So hurt people, come talk to me.
Hi, I'm Hillary Rosner. I'm a freelance journalist based in Colorado. I don't do news. I do exclusively features, magazine features. And I'm also an editor at the website Biographic, so I'm always looking for good story ideas for that, in addition to my own writing. I'm particularly interested right now in stories about animal movement and corridors and how we are changing the ways in which animals move around the planet. So please come and talk to me about that.
Hi, I'm Andrea Appleton. I'm a freelance journalist based in Baltimore, Maryland. And I write about a lot of things, but I'm particularly interested in the points where nature and culture collide. I also am interested in the philosophical implications of the way we're treating the world, not only the ecological ones. I'm particularly interested in talking to people who study human behavior here, but if you're passionate, I'm an easy mark.
Hi, my name is Brandon Keim. I'm a freelance journalist based in Bangor, Maine. My first book came out last year. It's called The Eye of the Sandpiper. And like everybody else, I'm interested in a lot of things, but especially curious these days in the intersection of animal minds and animal ethics with conservation. And I will be giving a speed talk on that on Tuesday morning at 9:15. So if you're interested, you should come and talk to me.
Hi, my name is Kara McKenna. I am the editor of an Indigenous magazine in BC called the Salish Sea Sentinel. So we cover Coast Salish First Nations, so I'm interested in anything that might be relevant to the nations that we cover and distribute to, as well as this whole topic of the intersection of Western science and Indigenous knowledge. So please come talk to me if you work in that area.
Hi, I'm Brian Owens. I'm a freelance writer from New Brunswick on Canada's East Coast. One thing I'm particularly interested in is I like to know, how do you know what you know? So if you have a cool method, especially if you invented a cool method, come and talk to me about that. I love stories about how science gets done.
I'm Sarah Cox. I write for the Narwhal, formerly DeSmog Canada, focusing on energy and the environment, and we dive deep into storytelling, also offering pointed commentary. And I just published a book called Reaching the Peace. It looks at the devastating human and ecological impacts of a large hydro dam in BC's northeast. And I am very interested right now in endangered species. I'm looking at the crazy things that we do to protect them and why we protect some species and not others, and how that is all wound up into policy and politics. So if you're working on endangered species, I would love to talk to you. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm John Upton. I'm a journalist at a group called Climate Central, which is based in New Jersey. We have scientists, researchers, a heavy data emphasis, and also a journalism program that I've been overhauling recently. Moving forward, we publish no news, but we do feature stories guided by a lot of science reporting and also local reporting, and published and produced in partnership predominantly with local outlets around the country. And, well, I'm interested in climate change and how it affects human beings, but some of the big projects we've got coming up of an interest to this group would include forest fires with a heavy emphasis on the pollution impacts, and also coastal change, including wetlands, but also the built environment.
Hi, my name is Brian Banks. I'm a Toronto-based feature writer, magazines mostly. I write for magazines like Canadian Geographic and Canadian Wildlife. I'm interested in just about everything that you guys do, and so I don't know how I'm going to pick sessions. This past week, I've been working on stories about bats, protected areas, wolves, so the whole gamut. But my really sort of built passion as a topic is roads and protected areas, roads and impact and connectivity and those sorts of things. So I've already feel like I've kind of got a good taste of stuff. Anyway, I'm looking forward to hear more about that.
Okay, thank you. So you can find all these folks by going to the Compass Twitter page, and there's a list there, NACCB 2018, and you can then follow all of the journalists here on that list. You can also reach them that way if you say, hey, I want to talk to you about such and such, and then go to the press room, what is the name of the press room again? Dockside 8. That can be a meeting place with journalists. And Tuesday night, you can come and pitch. You'll have 2 minutes, if you like, to pitch a story idea and get live, real-time feedback from these guys on what they found interesting about it, and a drink ticket. So on the topic of drink tickets, thanks, everybody, and let's go forth and start some chatting and conversations.
drink tickets.